On the topic of divorce, can you tell us a bit about a notorious figure on social media and YouTube, and that's Klaus Schwab and his organization that he represents, the World Economic Forum?
Yes. Yes, Schwab has often been touted as this, this purveyor of the interests of everybody. But yes, he's an insidious character. He's the founder of the World Economic Forum, and he emerged around the early 1970s when it was thought he challenged Milton Friedman's shareholder capitalism doctrine, which was all about profit at all costs. And rugged individualism, and shareholder self-interest. So Schwab around that time, the early 70s, argued that business is not just, and there's nothing wrong with what he was saying, is not just an economic unit, it's also a social organism. And he kind of situated this kind of thinking within an ecosystem of what he called multi-stakeholder capitalism, where people co-create value. In theory, all of this sounds very nice, right? Its contribution to society. He seemed to be saying that capitalism ought to be about value circulation and not just value capture. Now, this is all fine and well in theory, but the result of his work has been a call for a realignment of economic power and influence away from governments and the state and toward multinational corporations. That's the essence of his thinking, okay? And that's the reason that, the WEF today has become known as the Billionaires Club, okay, or the Davos class, as Samuel Huntington, called it. And it's really about promoting an agenda in which multinational corporations, the United States in particular, but also European multinational corporations, are unrestrained and untamed. Okay, and it's about diminishing the power of the states or their ability to regulate and tame these multinational corporations. Stripped of all of the rhetoric, essentially, this is what Klaus Schwab and his WEF represents. It's basically an elite agenda, And when you consider that the World Economic Forum is a closed shop, in other words, and I give the figure in my book, just in order to be a member, you've got to be, in the super rich stakes. You've got to have a turnover of several billion rands per annum. Your access fee is astronomical. Just to get a seat at the WEF is pretty huge. So it's created a culture and a reality of exclusion. Okay. And while Klaus Schwab goes on about economic inclusion, using these words like, these turns of phrases like inclusive growth and so on, the fact of the matter is that all of his policies, the very constitution of his organization, the WEF, its culture, the fact that they have these confabs at Davos every year, which is an exclusive resort in Switzerland, tells you a hell of a lot about this guy. All he wants really is to give a respectable face to what is otherwise a rabid, rapacious, and egregious capitalist system.
Yeah, you'd think if he wanted to change the lives of the ordinary man, he would go down to like the townships and step away from these elite conferences. But don't you think he changed his mind in a good way with his new book, The Great Reset? Or do you think it's much of the same?
I think it's important in reading The Great Reset to read it with what I've just said to you in mind. It's very easy, and Schwab is quite trained at Machiavellian tactics and antics. So he, often can get away with bloody murder and things he writes, which is essentially propaganda. So if you read it clinically, you can quite easily be convinced that this guy is a do-gooder. He talks about all these things. Like I said, he bangs the drum of inclusive growth and inclusive economies, multi-stakeholder capitalism, and so on. Removed from the context that I've just sketched, he could quite easily get away with these things. But the reality is one has got to read Schwab and read The Great Reset with what I've just talked to you about in mind. Ultimately, Schwab knows that if he doesn't win the active consent of people, then his agenda falls flat. Which is to give capitalism a respectable face, rather capitalism in its current form, a respectable face. And so to sustain the agenda and also sustain the agenda of globalization in its current form. right? He talks about things like, as you know, from reading The Great Reset, like technological innovations. And I just earlier spoke about the flip side of that argument, that if you aren't careful about the noise around the fourth industrial revolution and so on, which Schwab has appropriated as his agenda of the WEF, then you're going to let capital get off the hook, in the sense that the agenda that the platform corporations are pursuing in relation to the fourth industrial revolution is really about profit maximization, labor substitution, and capital intensity. That ultimately is it, and damn to hell with the rest of the world. So we've got to really be very careful about what we read and how we read things. You know, I always say that it's important to understand the agendas behind people who write propaganda. You know, the ideological agendas behind people who write propaganda, in order to come to terms with the very real nuts and bolts of what is being proposed in books and academic papers and policy papers and discussion papers and so on. You know, otherwise, the agenda of co-option and the agenda of winning active and passive consent, which is what Schwab is all about, wins. And one day we're all going to wake up to a world that is actually legitimized or is legitimizing the kind of rapid globalization that is going on, dominated by a handful of multinational corporations. And let's be clear, there are a handful of multinational corporations. I mean, the latest data, not the latest data, but recent data shows that, you know, and I know that this is starting to vary in a sense based on data that just came out yesterday, but the 10 richest men in the world basically doubled their wealth over the COVID period, over the past 2 years, which is disgusting, right? In the face of massive poverty and growing inequality. This is the reality of what has been going on. We've got to be very circumspect about this. You know, if we allow it to continue, and if we buy into this growth at all costs agenda of Klaus Schwab and his WEF, and of course the multilateral institutions that back him, the IMF and World Bank and so on, and the various people in government who are invested in this agenda, and certainly the billionaires club heavily invested in this agenda, we're going to wake up one day when things are actually worse, and believe me, things can get worse. If we think that they're bad enough, they can get worse. There's a kind of genocidal logic to what's going on. I see a drift toward authoritarian capitalism emerging, where the state, in a sense, is starting to merge with the power and interests of large multinational corporations and finance capital in particular. And this is creating rising rates of financialization in what I call a casino economy, a gambling economy. Very, very dangerous. We're building giant pools of resource scarcity for the poor and giant pools of abundance for the wealthy. This isn't humane. It's not sustainable. And we've got to really kind of begin to challenge this, you know, quite assertively.
If Klaus is such a representative of elite society and rich people, why would he coin the phrase, "You will own nothing and you will be happy"? What is the story behind that?
Yeah, look, you know, this notion of owning nothing, being happy. Well, you know, the point is Schwab needs to kind of, if he wants that to be a reality, then he needs to move away from the ethos of the billionaires club. And who will be happy? I mean, certainly the billionaires who are part of his club. You know, for the rest of us, it's simply, as I said earlier, it's about a handful of individuals in their blind endeavor to amass wealth, which by their estimation equates happiness, utterly impervious to the glut of society, to ordinary people, and to the environments that we rent on Earth. We rent the environment. It's not ours to own. It's about pure profit. So Schwab needs to catch a wake up when he talks about these things, because he can't pull the wool over people's eyes. If he's really serious about this, then he must scrap the WEF in its current form. You know, then he must begin to challenge his own logic of propping up multinational corporations, of diminishing the kind of role of the state. I'm not saying that the state is a solution. It's part of the problem. But diminishing the role of the state in its current form. You know, we've got to see that, you know, in a very real sense, a world where there is genuine wealth redistribution, where there is genuine sustainability, and where there's genuine cohesion, ought to equate notions of happiness and well-being. But certainly not insofar as Schwab is concerned. To answer your question, it's rhetoric, okay? It's rhetoric. Remember, when you build agendas, your first priority is to build legitimacy, or at least a veneer of legitimacy. Right? If you don't have legitimacy, then there's no way in which you can move an agenda forward. It's what's in kind of, in corporate parlance is called building buy-in, in a sense, from as broad a spectrum of society as possible. So I would treat his rhetoric about that, about you will own nothing and you will be happy. I would caution people to kind of read that not at face value, but read it on the basis of what the underlying agenda of the WEF and Klaus Schwab is. And as you know from reading the book, I devote something like 2 substantial chapters to tearing this apart. And I try to be as objective as possible in those chapters. So I give Klaus Schwab credit where credit is due, but I do take him apart where he needs to be taken apart, and in subtle ways. I stay away from the kind of aggressive ideological logic that tends to drive left-wing literature, and I position the narrative as objectively as I possibly can. But I certainly spend a lot of time demythologizing the Schwab factor and the WEF myth.